Power. It's a word that's thrown around all the time, right? But what does it actually look like when it's being used or abused? Well, today we're going to try to answer that by looking at just one single day, Friday, February 27th, 2026. And on this day, we saw power being flexed by presidents, built by huge corporations, challenged by the past, lost in a flash of chaos, and, yeah, horribly abused on a deeply personal level. So here's our roadmap. We're going to kick things off with a president making some big moves, both on the world stage and in the tech industry. Then we'll dive into a massive corporate merger with some serious political strings attached. After that, we'll see how a former president's past can come back to haunt him. Then we'll shift to a sudden, tragic loss of all control. And finally, we'll look at the absolute darkest side of power. All right, first up, the raw, direct use of executive power. On this single day, President Donald Trump used his authority in two completely different ways, affecting both an entire country and a single American tech company.
It all started with this pretty jaw-dropping statement. As he was leaving the White House, the president just casually floated the idea of a friendly takeover of Cuba. Now, this wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark, believe me. It was a huge signal of a major power play in the works.
And look, this idea didn't just come out of thin air. It came right after a U.S. energy blockade that had absolutely crippled Cuba's economy. The administration saw that the island was in deep, deep trouble. No money, no anything, as the president put it, and saw an opportunity to push for U.S. influence, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio spearheading the whole thing.
But get this, on the exact same day, the president's power was also aimed squarely at home. So while one hand was reaching out towards Cuba, the other was coming down hard on a major American AI company. It's a perfect illustration of just how broad executive power can be, stretching from global politics to domestic tech regulation.
So what was the deal here? Well, it basically boiled down to a huge standoff. The Pentagon wanted to use Anthropic's Claude AI with no strings attached. But Anthropic said, no way, and drew a hard line against their tech being used for mass surveillance or killer robots. So, in response, the defense secretary slapped them with a supply chain risk label, and boom, the president banned them from all federal agencies. It's a massive clash between national security and corporate ethics, and now it's heading to court.
Okay, so from the power of government, let's shift gears to corporate power. Because on the same day, a deal was finalized to create an absolute titan in the media world. And the story behind it, well, it's tangled up in a whole lot of political influence. $110 billion. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's the price Paramount paid to buy Warner Bros. Discovery. And this isn't just some regular business deal. Nope. This is about creating an entertainment empire that's going to fundamentally change what you and I watch.
And what does $110 billion get you?
Oh, just an incredible collection of content. We're talking two of the most legendary studios in Hollywood, major news networks like CNN and broadcast networks like CBS, premium cable like HBO, and oh yeah, just a few small franchises you might have heard of. Harry Potter, the DC Universe, Game of Thrones, Star Trek, the whole shebang, all under one roof. The mission is pretty clear: build a giant to fight the streaming wars.
But here's where the story gets really juicy. The losing bidder here was Netflix, which had been getting hammered by political attacks for its supposedly woke shows. The winning bid from Paramount? It was financed by Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle, who just happens to be a major ally and advisor to President Trump. So you see, this deal wasn't just about movies and TV shows. It was a battle in the culture war, fought in a corporate boardroom. All right, let's pivot again. We've talked about power in the present. Now let's talk about the long shadow of the past. Because on this very same day, former President Bill Clinton got a stark reminder that old relationships have a power all their own, forcing him to answer for connections from decades ago.
Let's just walk through the history here. It all started back in the early 2000s with what was called a brief acquaintance. That acquaintance included a handful of trips on Jeffrey Epstein's private jet for work related to the Clinton Foundation. Fast forward years later, after Epstein's arrest, and those flights, those connections, they led directly to this day, February 27th, 2026, and a closed-door testimony in front of a House committee. So, under oath, Clinton was absolutely firm. He insisted he had zero knowledge of Epstein's crimes, and said he'd cut ties long before the 2019 arrest. This quote really gets to the heart of his defense, which is basically, I was completely in the dark about who this man really was.
And it's worth remembering this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Just one day earlier, Hillary Clinton gave her own testimony. She also said she had no information and, in fact, didn't even remember ever meeting Epstein. It was clearly a unified front to create as much distance as possible from a deeply toxic association.
Okay, we've been talking about the calculated, managed power of Washington and Wall Street. Now, we are making a hard turn. We are going to an event that is defined by the complete opposite, a sudden, terrifying, and tragic loss of all control.
15. That was the initial death toll after a Bolivian Air Force cargo plane went down while trying to land in La Paz. In one split second, all the systems, all the pilot's control, all the power that keeps a massive plane in the air, it just vanished.
And the scene on the ground was something else. Pure chaos. The plane wasn't just carrying people, it was carrying pallets of newly printed money, and that cash was scattered all over the wreckage. As you can imagine, crowds started to gather, and things got so intense that riot police actually had to use tear gas to control the scene. It's just this visceral image of how fast order can completely fall apart.
And for our last story, we're bringing our theme of power all the way down to its most intimate, its most corrupt, and its most heartbreaking form. Because on this day, justice was finally served for an abuse of power that targeted the absolute most vulnerable. The case centered on a U.S. Embassy employee stationed in Burkina Faso. And you might be asking, how was he prosecuted back in the States? Well, it's because of this federal initiative, Project Safe Childhood. It basically says that your U.S. passport is not a shield that lets you commit horrible crimes in other countries. The details from the Department of Justice are frankly, they're sickening to even read. This diplomat didn't just use his position of authority. He used the desperation of a family with a dying mother as leverage. He wielded his power, his money, his status, to demand the absolute unthinkable from two young girls. And make no mistake, this was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a cold, calculated, predatory plan. He targeted his victims, he exploited their greatest fear, and he even used technology to make the abuse easier. And then, when he got caught, his first move was to try and use his power again to get his housekeeper to lie for him. It just shows you how methodical and chilling the whole thing was. But on this day, his power ran out. The final judgment came down. A life sentence. Full stop. It was a definitive statement that this kind of horrific abuse of power will face the most serious consequence there is. So that brings us right back to where we started. One day, February 27th, 2026. You've got a president's directive, a catastrophic plane crash, a massive media merger, and a gut-wrenching courtroom verdict. Each one is a totally different face of power. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? The next time you're scrolling through the news, are you going to see a bunch of random, separate stories? Or are you going to see the hidden connections in the constant, complex game of power?